Thank you everyone for joining us today. Our topic is PBM Audits 2025, Mid-Year Trends, Triggers, and Tactics for Pharmacy Protection. We do a version of this webinar almost every year, if not twice a year, and you'll see a lot of consistent messaging throughout our webinars. One of them is always to be proactive rather than reactive. And by joining this webinar today, I think all of you guys are already doing that by being proactive, understanding exactly what's going on in the realm of PBM audits. And so my name is Harini Bupathi. I'm a partner here at Frier Levitt. I work with primarily pharmacy providers in maintaining good relationships, if there is such a thing, of course, with their PBMs and of course other payers as well. This could include retail pharmacies, specialty pharmacies, long-term care, mail order, etc. I work with pharmacies when it comes to sort of the A to Z as it relates to issues related to audits, network access issues, terminations, wrongful recruitments, and of course, FWA investigations, which we'll get into as well. In addition to working with pharmacies, of course, on issues related to PBMs, we'll also be working with pharmacies on pharmacy-related transactions. Of course, in this space, there's a lot of buy and sell and M&A, and there's a lot of nuanced aspects of pharmacy transactions that we also go through. Importantly, this presentation is solely for purposes of getting information out to you guys. And nothing in this presentation should be construed as legal advice, of course. To the extent that you do seek legal advice or the consult of an attorney, I highly recommend one, especially if you're going through an audit or any sort of aspect related to actually needing substantive legal advice. Certainly consult an attorney. Just a little bit about our firm. We are a national boutique life sciences and healthcare law firm. We represent pharmacies, physicians, providers just across the United States. Our life sciences team, which I am a partner of, represents, like I said, pharmacies, providers across all types, essentially anybody along the Drug Supply Chain Act. There's multiple different types of practice groups here at Frier Levitt on our life sciences side, including the pharmacy practice group that I'm a partner of, as well as our transactional team, our litigation team, our regulatory team, and our investigation team. Essentially, you can think that if you need assistance in any aspect of your pharmacy, there's a full team of attorneys at your service. We also have a healthcare side where we advise physicians, group practices, hospitals, the like, just anyone essentially along the healthcare spectrum. We also have a number of clinician attorneys, which is very important, especially when we're talking about PBM audits, because of course, there's a lot of clinical aspects when it comes to pharmacy that's certainly helpful. So we do have a number of clinician attorneys and pharmacist attorneys as well. So the conversation today, like I said, is about mid-year audit trends. Every year we publish a checklist just to make sure that pharmacies are taking a look inwards to understand what aspects of their pharmacy practice they could otherwise review, develop, and make sure that they're otherwise staying in compliance of. So throughout the presentation, we'll certainly focus on what we've seen in the past, which is always consistent, things that we always continue to see. You'll see a lot of repetitive sort of audit trends, but still key audit trends, because you can certainly expect that auditors are still continuing to look into the same aspects when they conduct these audits. Other things that we'll also go through are common triggers and red flags. What are PBMs certainly looking at now? What do they continue to look at? And then, of course, how to look inwards to understand what your risk is when you understand what these audit triggers are. We'll also go into what your best practices are for response. You get hit with an audit. What do you do exactly? What are some practical legal tools and administrative tools that you have at your disposal when you're trying to address an audit? And then, of course, what's ahead? Like I said, it's always really helpful to be proactive rather than reactive. A lot of the times people are very pessimistic when it comes to their relationships with PBMs, and of course within reason, with good reason to be so. But at the same time, of course, you're trying to maintain a sustainable business in today's landscape. And so it's really important to understand exactly what changes you could expect. And then going back to, like I said, the tools that you have at your disposal to make sure that you otherwise strengthen your pharmacy practice, especially as you go into the rest of 2025. I say this because it's really notorious for PBMs to look at pharmacies that participate in their network and see how they performed, throughout the year to see if they want to increase the number of pharmacies that they're otherwise looking to remove going into the next calendar year. And so we'll go into the difference between audits and investigations. There's certain PBMs for which I can say I haven't seen an audit in years. I've been at Frier Levitt for close to 9 years, and there's a certain PBM that I can think of that barely does audits, and they only ever really do investigations. There's certain reasons as to why PBMs only do investigations, or why they're calling their audits investigative audits now. One of the reasons, of course, is to circumvent a lot of fair audit laws. Many of you guys are located in states, hopefully, where there are fair audit laws, which we'll go into as well. And a lot of the times those fair audit laws have an exception for the application of those fair audit laws to audits. And those exceptions extend to a suspicion of FWA. And so a lot of the times when PBMs allege FWA and then conduct an investigation of the pharmacy, they're giving themselves more bandwidth to be able to do that review of the pharmacy and to circumvent fair audit laws that otherwise would be applicable. That said, some common elements are related to audits. Typically, we'll see desktop audits or on-site audits where pharmacies are being asked to provide a host of prescription documentation. That could include, of course, a front and back of a copy of a prescription, your signature log, copay information, essentially anything related to the dispensing of the prescription. Sometimes if there's notes related to the dispensing or like the substitution of prescription, those will also want to be submitted, et cetera. So there's usually a list of prescriptions identified on that initial audit notice that comes in from the PBM. In addition to the prescription aspect of an audit, it's also really common for PBMs to conduct a an invoice reconciliation in which they ask pharmacies to contact their wholesalers and to submit purchase data. We'll go into this a little bit more, but this is one of the most common areas that we'll see pharmacies kind of trip themselves over. It's mostly because depending on the wording of the audit notice itself, it can be very confusing to a pharmacy that's never seen these notices before or received an audit to go through an invoice reconciliation. For example, I have seen many pharmacies suggest or indicate, hey, I got audit results and I have X audit results because they didn't ask me for the purchase data for all these other medications. They only asked me for the purchase data related to the prescriptions that they identified in the first part of the audit. Unfortunately, it sounds like that would be the reasonable ask, but it isn't. What likely happened is, yes, the PBM asked you for the prescription documentation for that list of prescriptions, but there's probably a second part in which they asked you for your purchase data for all of the prescriptions that you've dispensed during a certain audit period. And so when a pharmacy submits the purchase data only for a couple of prescriptions, of course, unfortunately, the problem is that the PBM will suggest that the pharmacy didn't submit purchase data for all their other prescriptions dispensed during the audit period, and then suggest those to be discrepancies. In a reasonable world, yes, the auditor should be alerting you to that and should be working through that to make sure you're then given sufficient time to submit the purchase data, but that, of course, isn't always the case. So it's really important that when you receive notice of an audit, that you're reading it carefully, especially when you're being asked to submit purchase data. It's also really important to make sure that you are capturing all of your wholesalers. Your primary wholesalers, of course, but then also your secondary wholesalers, maybe some that you don't even remember that you purchased from like 2 years ago, and to make sure that you really are capturing all your wholesalers, because I have seen on occasion auditors refusing to accept purchases where they're not otherwise included on a wholesaler purchase attestation form, meaning the form that you're otherwise asked to submit to confirm who all your wholesalers are. This could also extend to marketplace purchases as well as purchases made from other pharmacies, which we'll go into when it comes to sort of what the reasons why we see inventory shortages are. In addition, we have on-site audits as well. Some could be unannounced. Typically, you do receive a notice of an audit, unless, of course, you're seeking admission into a network, then we'll see a lot more unannounced audits in those instances. And then, of course, you could either get a masked or unmasked list of prescriptions. Now, by contrast, you have investigations. And so investigations and audits do often look very similar. Like I said, there's certain language that you'll see in these communications that really distinguish the two, but Oftentimes in investigations and investigative audits, we'll also see questionnaires that are being sent out to patients and prescribers before you're even aware of the fact that you're undergoing some sort of review by the PBM. Sometimes those questionnaires could be directed to patients to request clarification or confirmation that the patient requested their medication, that they've received their medication, that they paid their copay, how they pay their copay, how they receive their medication as well. And then maybe even how they came about to use the pharmacy services. Most of these times the questionnaire is in written form, so it is certainly a choice to your patients and your prescribers to provide a response back to the auditor. Sometimes we've also seen auditors actually contact patients and prescribers via phone as well. The other difference between investigations that we often see are shorter times to respond to the request from the PBM. This could mean that you may receive an audit and then just be given just like 14 days to go ahead and provide all of the information. There's not significant time to always gather the documentation information required. And so, like I said, with investigations, you might see much more shorter aggressive time periods. There's also more documentation requirements than you might see in an audit. And they may ask you to obtain medical records from the prescriber's office. It's not an uncommon ask that we've seen where they may allege, patient-prescriber relationship issues. Provider or pharmacy must obtain medical records from a provider's office. I distinguish those especially because in an audit, that's not typically a request that we might always see. An investigative audit, an investigation, that's much more of a common ask. In addition, there's also less avenues sometimes for administrative appeals. I say that because there's certain discrepancies, and we'll go into them, where some PBMs may not allow for a further review of an appeal, depending on the type of discrepancies that are outstanding in an investigative audit or an investigation, to be further reviewed by the PBM. And again, of course, we'll go through sort of what remedies the pharmacy has in those instances. And so what could trigger either? Audits are usually performed routinely. If you haven't gone through one in like 2 years or 3 years, you can certainly expect that they're done on a regular basis. Maybe you get regular desktop reviews or claim reviews, but there's also certain pharmacy conduct that can also trigger an audit. Certain things are, the volume of drugs billed. All of a sudden, you've engaged in a marketing practice or a marketing company, and the volume of prescriptions that you otherwise dispense has skyrocketed. Those are usually, it's a reason for a PBM to understand, not to understand, but to really look into the pharmacy's practices to then understand why the pharmacy's volume has all of a sudden increased. Then there's also the question of where a lot of these prescriptions are otherwise coming from. If there's a volume of prescriptions coming from non-local prescribers or being filled for non-local patients, that could also be another reason for a PBM to otherwise trigger an audit. And for the same reasons, PBMs could also, of course, initiate investigations. Like I said, some PBMs just don't even do audits anymore. They only do investigations. And so in addition to sort of the volume of drugs being billed, and as well as where your prescribers are in relation to the pharmacy and your patients are in relation to the pharmacy, we'll also see investigations be initiated when PBMs receive complaints from patients or prescribers, or they receive referrals from regulatory agencies. We've seen, different parts of the government, particularly so we'll see some reports being issued to PBMs by certain parts of the government, related to, again, those dispensing practices, just for PBMs to be made aware of them. And then, of course, that could then turn into a reason for the PBM to initiate investigation. Then there's the internal analytics. Like I mentioned, again, that goes back to sort of whether or not the pharmacy is acting as an outlier. A lot of the times PBMs will understand whether your pharmacy is considered to be an outlier compared to other pharmacies in the network. And I guess this is a good point to kind of say that most of this presentation, I will say, is catered certainly towards independent pharmacies or pharmacies that are contracted under a retail agreement. And so even though you may classify yourself as a specialty pharmacy or mail order pharmacy, to the extent that you have a retail pharmacy agreement, this is still all applicable to you. And so we move to audit discrepancies to always be aware of. For folks that have joined us from other webinars, this is certainly something that you'll recognize. And this is really important because you can still expect that despite these being the most common discrepancies for many years now, that these continue to be the most common discrepancies that a lot of pharmacies still continue to face when we're talking about audits or investigations with PBMs. The biggest thing is drug inventory shortages, DIS discrepancies. Essentially, these are the discrepancies that are identified when a pharmacy goes through an invoice reconciliation, which I mentioned earlier, and a PBM suggests that or identifies that the quantity purchased by the pharmacy in a particular audit period doesn't support the quantity that's otherwise dispensed and billed to during a particular audit period. So, for example, let's just skip ahead here. In this example, right, for the calendar period of January 2024 to December 2024, the pharmacy submitted data to suggest that they purchased 200 units of a medication. But in that same audit period, they otherwise dispensed and billed for 300 units, which means that your shortfall would be 100 units. And so the PBM would otherwise suggest that there's an inventory shortfall of 100 units and then would subject the pharmacy to that recovery related to the claims that amount to that 100 units of that shortfall. Whereas in some instances, pharmacies could reasonably purchase a couple months prior to the next calendar year, especially because I'm sure you guys all know, with your wholesalers, your prices could go up in January. And so it makes a lot of sense to stockpile a little bit of medication, especially in anticipation of you needing to dispense that the following calendar year. And so in this instance, the pharmacy reasonably actually purchased 200 units in November of 2023, which is about 2 months prior to the audit period. And that led the pharmacy to actually have an inventory or a purchase amount of 400 for that whole audit period. And again, they had only dispensed 300. So really, they had still 100 units going into the audit period and throughout the audit period of surplus. And so in inventory shortages, while it seems simple, the reason that so many shortages and so many discrepancies happen is because PBMs have very nuanced hyper-technical limitations on the pharmacy's ability to purchase medications. You have PBMs who require you to purchase from licensed wholesalers or from NABP accredited wholesalers only. You also have PBMs that will also limit how far back you can make purchases for as well. There's certain PBMs that will limit you from making a purchase significantly prior to the point of dispensing. And should you make what is considered to be a bulk purchase, which could be construed to be a quantity of purchased of 30-day supply, meaning that what you expect to purchase today will then be enough for your next 30 days. Anything more than that would be considered to be a bulk purchase. That PBMs will require you to notify them of that bulk purchase, especially because if you go through an audit and you didn't notify them of that bulk purchase in advance, it's possible and very likely, and we're seeing this now, and we'll go through a case study, that your purchase wouldn't otherwise be accepted and considered for the purpose of trying to reconcile an inventory shortage. So it's really important when it comes to inventory shortages or invoice reconciliations that you're purchasing from licensed verifiable wholesalers and accredited wholesalers to the extent that you're required to. And in the instance of where you're not purchasing from wholesalers or licensed or NABP accredited wholesalers, you're purchasing from a pharmacy marketplace, or you're purchasing from the pharmacy down the street that's closing from you, that you otherwise make sure that you have the required documentation and information that you're required to maintain under each specific PBM provider manual to be able to document that purchase so that it's being considered should you ever be subject to an invoice reconciliation audit. It's really important. I say this because, especially now, we're seeing a lot more purchases from other sources outside of wholesalers. Again, I understand the concept of needing to be able to find a cheaper product, especially in the world of lowering reimbursement rates, to be able to make sure that you're making some money on your claims. But at the same time, to the extent that you're purchasing from alternate sources, to make sure that you're otherwise documenting those purchases adequately. There's also an increased requirement that we're seeing from PBMs for pharmacies to maintain T3 documentation, or transaction information, transaction statement, and transaction history, especially in the instances of where a pharmacy isn't making purchases for specific patient need, meaning that they're not just buying a particular medication just because they got a prescription, but again, they're buying it in anticipation of needing it in the future, then to have sufficient inventory. And so in those instances, you can expect that PBMs will have excessive and more documentation requirements and to be able to have them accept those purchases in the event of an invoice reconciliation. And so we'll talk about, again, sort of what you could do in terms of making sure you have a sufficient inventory management policy. Going back to sort of the discrepancies to always be aware of, copayment collection is always a big discrepancy that we continue to see. There's a lot of instances where pharmacies are being asked to provide additional documentation. That could mean a merchant report for credit card transactions. It could mean a deposit into your bank statement, a bank account for cash copays as well. And so there's significant more documentation requirements when it comes to copayment collection discrepancies to be able to overcome them and to also demonstrate that you're collecting sufficient copays from your patients. And then what happens, of course, in the instance of where you don't collect copays from your patients, but you want to demonstrate that you've exhausted all your good faith efforts to collect. And then, of course, what if a patient indicates they can't collect their copays? Those are the instances, and we'll talk about this, of why it's so important to have a sufficient copayment collection policy in place and a financial hardship policy in place that you actually follow through with. A lot of the times we'll see some PBMs actually identify exactly what certain elements are required of these types of policies for copayment collection and financial hardship policies. And so to the extent that you don't have one in place, it's really important that you do have one and that it's adhered to accurately. You can also expect at the time of an audit that some pharmacies in some audit requests are actually being asked to submit copies of their copayment collection policies, because it's almost expected that a lot of pharmacies should have one at this point. Other audit discrepancies that we often see are patient denials, whether they denied requesting or receiving their prescription. Again, this goes back to the questionnaires that we'll often see investigators or auditors send out to patients of, did you receive your medication? Did you not receive your medication? And so it's certainly important to make sure that you maintain all of the required documentation to demonstrate that you have patient authorization prior to the point of dispensing. Similarly, we'll also see a lot of prescriber denials. That happens especially a lot when, when there could be a change to a particular prescription. And so, you'd want to make sure that everything is being appropriately documented on the pharmacy's end in the event of a future audit. It's also great to make sure that you're having I don't want to say constant communication, but a means of communication with your patients and prescribers, especially if you are hit with these types of discrepancies, to be able to, have the means to be able to communicate with them to try to overturn them. Because a lot of the times when it comes to these discrepancies, it's almost like a timeline. Yes, you've contacted the patient. Yes, you obtained their authorization, and then you dispense the medication. But at some point thereafter, the auditor went ahead and did the same thing and asked the patient. Of course, it's not fair because they're asking the patient to test their memory for things that they got a year ago from the pharmacy. But unfortunately, we'll see patients rely on their not so great memory to then deny requesting or receiving, which then leads the pharmacy to a position to having to go back to the patient to try to get them to help cooperate with the pharmacy's original receipt of their patient's authorization at the point of dispensing, to then clarify those types of discrepancies to the auditors. So it's almost like a timeline to keep in mind. But of course, at the same time, it's very important for the pharmacy to make sure that they maintain their own independent documentation prior to the point of dispensing. And so we'll just go back to the invoice reconciliation just a little bit. But like I said, we're seeing a lot more of this happen now because bulk purchase notification requirements for a particular PBM kicked in around 2022. And so we're seeing a lot more audits now because, for purchases made after 2022, it's kind of like we're in that time period right now where pharmacies are getting audited for inventory, their inventory for 2023, 2024. And so in this instance, we've seen a pharmacy get audited for their purchases and their claims submitted for a little bit over, like a year and a half period. And so the PBM suggested that there were audit shortages because the pharmacy didn't have sufficient purchases during the audit period. And so we worked with the pharmacy to be able to obtain copies of their bulk purchase notifications that they actually made to the PBM, and so that the PBM would accept them during the audit period. And so the pharmacy did adhere to those bulk purchase notification requirements ahead of time and did make them. And so in this instance, we were able to lower all of the inventory shortage discrepancies. Conveniently, of course, the PBM completely forgot that they had given or that they had acknowledged the pharmacy's bulk purchase notifications that they were made. And so in that instance, we were able to resolve them. But of course, not every pharmacy could find itself in this situation because, again, because these requirements go back to 22 of making these notifications, it's possible that you may start to find yourself kind of creeping into the period of time of where you may have otherwise been required to make this notification and you didn't. And so it's really important to understand what your obligations are to make those notifications and make sure that, again, any sort of notifications are well documented and that any sort of purchases, again, are well documented as well. With inventory shortages in particular, especially if you're making bulk purchases, it's really important to not solely rely on your wholesalers' data. It's also really important to make sure you're maintaining your own independent data as well. While PBMs will want to still see that data be submitted from wholesalers, a lot of the times the things that we're running into is that wholesalers can only go back so far to then submit the data to the PBM unless the PBM changes up their audit request notice or the wholesaler gets a subpoena. And so in either one of those instances where it might not be possible, still really important to demonstrate that your pharmacy has sufficient purchases and to maintain its own independent records related to those purchases. And so, like I said, those are discrepancies that we continue to see. I've seen them for years now. And the reason that we talk about, let me go back to the slide because it's really important. These types of discrepancies is because more often than not, these are the discrepancies that I'd say are concerning in nature and often lead to further action by PBMs. Certainly drug inventory shortages, copay collection, patient denials, prescriber denials, often the types of discrepancies that often lead to network termination or an escalation of the issue to perhaps, like a state board of pharmacy, or in instances of where further appeal reviews may not be granted because of the type of classification of discrepancies. And so going into 2025, and so what we've seen kind of so far, again, we'll continue to see those discrepancies I mentioned, but other things that we're continuing to see and we're starting to see a lot more of are reviews into pharmacies' relationships with third parties. And so this happens a lot when pharmacies, and we're seeing, I'd say in like the last 1-2 years, and we've always seen pharmacies that have third-party marketing relationships, and they'll continue, and we'll talk about that. But this is more so for those parties or companies that have been contracting with pharmacies for the purposes of suggesting they're streamlining their pharmacy software systems or conducting benefits verifications. And the question that you'd have to ask yourself, and a lot of PBMs are asking, is whether or not they have access to your pharmacy's NPI, your credentials, and whether or not they have the ability to submit claims on the pharmacy's behalf. We've seen an increase of audits for pharmacies that came in solely because third parties have been submitting essentially test claims or benefits verification, benefit verification / test claims. And that essentially means that there might not be a valid prescription behind that claim that's being submitted. And so, claims are being submitted and they're soon being reversed. But in that meantime, what's happening is that this third party is essentially getting a screenshot into what reimbursement looks like for the pharmacy, whether something is being covered, at what rate, et cetera. And so PBMs are finding that to be very concerning because a lot of that data is supposed to be confidential in between PBM and the pharmacy. And so not only are they concerned that test claims are being run, essentially claims phishing, but also that another third party has access to the pharmacy's credentials. And so this happens when, again, when you have these types of streamlined pharmacy service type of third-party relationships or sort of hub relationships as well. A lot of the times PBMs will look into whether or not that relationship is appropriate under the terms of their agreement, whether or not that relationship, importantly, is disclosed to PBMs. In reality, if you were to disclose it, would it otherwise be okay with the PBM? Probably not, but the failure to disclose that relationship in and of itself has been a reason to not only subject the pharmacy to potential recovery over any claims that were actually processed and dispensed on as a result of that third-party relationship, but also means a potential termination just solely because of that existence of that relationship, in addition to the fact that this third party could be otherwise claims phishing or submitting test claims on the pharmacy's behalf. And so to the extent that you have any of these types of relationships or anyone that's being given access to sort of, I'd say this otherwise confidential information, it's important to understand what their bandwidth is in getting access to this and whether or not it's required to be disclosed under your terms of your provider agreement. Other things that we're seeing a lot of are instances of where manufacturers are actually getting or sending out communications to patients. Sorry, not patients, to pharmacies. We see this a lot, and we've always seen this in the instance of like a lot of diabetic testing supply manufacturers that have sent out communications in the past to pharmacies for not purchasing from authorized distributors. Maybe that might not have always been a requirement, whatever it might be, but we're also seeing it in the instances of some manufacturers, and more recently AstraZeneca, who sent out notices to pharmacies for flagging them for not purchasing enough of their Farxiga and instead and potentially dispensing the generic instead of dispensing the brand when also billing for the brand. And so a lot of the times we're seeing a lot more manufacturers kind of look into sort of what the pharmacies purchasing and dispensing is. And again, that's through a simple invoice reconciliation that they're able to do because again, they have the manufacturers do very similar reviews. And so of course the concern is whether or not the pharmacy has a contractual relationship to respond to manufacturers. That's certainly something to consider. But then the practical considerations of what if we don't resolve this with the manufacturer? Could this escalate into further action with our PBMs as well? And so those are things that we're seeing now when it comes to audits, not just like PBM audits, but also manufacturer reviews, looking into pharmacies as well. Again, when it comes to claims phishing, right? Like I said, well, we've seen many instances of this, and it's still conversations are still in progress when it comes to the claims phishing issue, where PBMs are still suggesting that the submission of claims without a valid prescription is claims testing, not otherwise permitted by PBMs. And in addition, PBMs are suggesting that any of these types of arrangements should have otherwise been disclosed to the PBM. It's really important to make sure that if you have any third-party relationships, that you understand what your obligations are to disclose them. Because if you go back to your credentialing like application, maybe when you first got in, when you're first applying into the network, sometimes you're actually required to disclose what third-party contractors or companies that you otherwise have relationships with that you do business in excess of X amount of. And so there may be requirements to otherwise disclose that. There's also requirements to disclose, like I said, third-party relationships that have access to confidential PBM data under your provider agreements and manuals as well. The other things that we're seeing when it comes to audits is the escalation to boards of pharmacy. A lot of the times, unresolved audit findings could certainly lead to a referral to a board of pharmacy. Now, we'll see that not every audit makes its way to the board, of course, nor does every complaint to the board mean that there's going to be certain action against the pharmacy as well. But at the same time, those are still things to keep in mind that while it might be a minor audit finding, like I said, if it's concerning in nature, it's not out of the realm that a PBM auditor makes a complaint to the board of pharmacy. Relatively simple, actually, for them to do that. They just attach a copy of their audit results and then, make a complaint, submit that to the board of pharmacy, and it's up to the board of pharmacy as to whether or not they want to initiate it. Similarly, it's also really important to make sure that PBMs are, that to the extent that a board of pharmacy does initiate an action or take any, take any action against the pharmacy, that they're otherwise being timely disclosed to PBMs. And that goes into sort of the third point here, reviewing into of PBMs when they conduct audits, right, regular routine audits about pharmacies, that they're also checking to make sure that the pharmacies have updated all of their information with the PBM. That could mean, like making sure your contact information is updated, but also something as complex as making sure your ownership is disclosed and updated as well with the PBM. And then also, like I said, any sort of board of pharmacy action as well. In fact, we've seen an increase of instances of where pharmacies have not reported board orders or actions to PBMs where they were otherwise required to report them. And that turns into a whole nother issue of potential network termination there as well. Like I said, we're also seeing, again, increased scrutiny into marketing relationships. A lot of the times in these questionnaires that you receive from in the course of like an investigation, you could also be asked to understand for you to make sure the auditor understands where, how your business is being generated. And so you could expect to answer some questions about any sort of third-party marketing relationships or any marketing tactics that you use to be able to get your pharmacy's name out there. The other thing that we continue to see is mailing post-COVID-19. Ever since the expiration of the PHE, we're still seeing a lot of pharmacies still engage in mailing, even though they're under a retail agreement where some PBMs do limit mailing altogether. Some PBMs do allow pharmacies to continue mailing under a certain percentage, also perhaps with a certain mile radius and that percentage. But then some PBMs also limit mailing or prohibit mailing altogether. And there's always a distinguishment between mailing and delivery. And so it's important to make sure you're aware of those differences depending on your provider agreements and your manuals, so that you're making sure that you're otherwise in compliance, because we're seeing a lot of audit recoveries related to claims that are being mailed. We're also seeing a lot of cease and desist letters. We're also seeing a lot of terminations over pharmacies that continue to mail as well. There are certain states, of course, that do allow pharmacies to mail. We have observed some states, and I should say some, I say some, I've said it too loosely already, but I'd say there's 1 to 2 states that I can think of for some PBMs that have allowed them to otherwise mail into. And so if you are engaged in mailing or, that's part of your pharmacy practice, it's important to understand if your state may have some protections for you to be able to continue mailing under your retail agreement. And so preparing for audits, like I said, most of you guys have already done more than a lot of folks have already done just by attending a webinar like this. It's really important to make sure you're aware of the areas that PBMs are looking into. There's certain aspects of just like your day-to-day practice that could really impact your ability to be prepared for an audit, your ability to have a clear audit, and to make sure that there's no discrepancies. For example, and I always go back to inventory shortages because it's something almost like as simple as your day-to-day that could have a big impact. But for example, you received a prescription for X medication, but X medication is out of stock in your pharmacy, and so you placed an order for it. But you went ahead and you billed a claim for it. Technically, most PBMs will suggest that the date that you've submitted the claim should be the date that you filled the medication. But you obviously didn't fill the medication that day because you didn't have the medication in hand. You ordered it and you won't be receiving it until the next day or the day after, and it's a weekend maybe. And so technically PBMs will expect that the date that you fill the medication lines up with the date that you submitted the claim. And that's important, especially when you're going through an inventory shortage, because that can impact whether or not on like a day-to-day basis, if they were to do a point in time reconciliation, at that point in time when you submitted the claim, did you have the medication in stock or did you have a shortage? Technically, that could be considered to be a shortage. And so that's why something as simple as your day-to-day operations could really have a big impact on these types of discrepancies. And in those instances where you didn't have the medication in stock, then you received it 2 days later, were those 2 days later, would that have been considered outside of the audit period or after the audit period? And if so, your auditor may not accept that purchase, could result in discrepancy, and then could lead to further action against the pharmacy. So again, day-to-day operations make a big impact on sort of your ability to be prepared for these type of audits. The biggest thing out of all of these things, especially when it comes to a pharmacy audit or PBM audit, is to be organized. There is so much documentation that is being asked of pharmacies now throughout these audits and investigations. Like I said, with investigations, we'll see a lot more documentation being required. There's also instances, like I said, where your vendors, where your wholesalers, where your merchant who is supposed to generate the merchant report for you to demonstrate you received your payment on a credit card transaction, they could only be keeping this data for a year. They could only be keeping the data for 18 months. Your audits could go back as far as 2 years, you may have an obligation to maintain documentation for 5 to 10 years, depending on the type of claim. It's really important that you make sure that you keep all of your records together, that you keep it well organized. I'm sure in a busy pharmacy, the expectation is that you're also having to dedicate resources to running your pharmacy, but then answering audits as well. And so you want to make sure everything is well organized. And it sounds simple, but it really goes a long way. And this is especially important when you have short turnaround times in the course of investigation. And so you want to be able to have all the information you otherwise should have or can be expected to have available. And should you need to get more information, that's really where you're allocating your time and your resources, is to get any additional documents post receipt of those audit results. The other things are to review common audit areas. Like I said, anything that almost considers pharmacies to be outliers in a day-to-day could be a reason for an audit or to be a target of an audit. And so oftentimes we'll see instances of where you might want to pay more attention to or spot check particular claims to make sure your documentation's in order for those types of medications, especially because those might be the ones where you might get hit more with your like day-to-day claim audit reviews or like a desktop review. And so you may want to just do a spot check every now and then of particular prescriptions. The other thing is to ensure your staff is properly trained. This doesn't just include your FWA training that you otherwise may have to provide a certificate of completion for when you credential or like every year or something. This means that your pharmacy staff is very well aware of your pharmacy's practices. More often than not, when we receive audits, it's not uncommon for me to hear a pharmacy owner saying, "Oh, the relief pharmacist or the staff pharmacist made a mistake, and this is what happened." It's really important to make sure that everybody in your pharmacy is appropriately being trained on the policies that you've implemented, and you're expecting them to otherwise follow through. And then also, of course, that in the instance of where, say that there's non-compliance with a particular policy, it's really important to understand what the pharmacy has done or what the pharmacy did in those instances. Maybe there are corrective actions being taken. And if so, were they documented, et cetera? And so that kind of brings us to the next point of being able to conduct internal audits every year. And we'll try to update it almost like at least a year. Frier Levitt puts out a checklist, and it's something as simple as just almost like an internal ask of yourself, or am I doing this? And it really helps to go down through the list. And so, if you search PBM audit checklist, or if you, are familiar with Frier Levitt's checklist, we certainly encourage you to go through it, because it just helps you kind of internalize sort of what to kind of look into your pharmacy's aspects or your pharmacy's operations and aspects that you might have otherwise even thought to look into. The other thing is to be able to prepare responses in advance, especially if you're keeping your documentation well organized and you know that there could be something missing or there was oversight, to be able to be prepared what to do in those instances. And that goes back to the corrective actions that I mentioned that really go a long way as well. Also leave some time for questions. So just really quickly, the key policies and procedures that I would really make sure that you in your pharmacy practice have are copay collection and financial hardship policy, period. Everyone should have one, certainly. An inventory management policy, again, there's so many aspects of inventory management. This could include where you purchase from, making sure you're billing accurate NDCs, misbilling NDCs, and generic versus brand, and even generic versus generic NDCs is a big point of issues when it comes to invoice reconciliation discrepancies. And so having a robust inventory management policy is really important. Being able to demonstrate that you're validating all your prescriptions upon receipt, that you're obtaining appropriate authorization from your patients prior to the point of dispensing. If they're on auto refill, what kind of auto refill policy do you have in place, et cetera? Those are all aspects of what I'd consider to be prescription validation. The other thing would be prior authorization. This continues to be an audit issue, and we didn't go into detail in this particular presentation, but it will always continue to be a key area of audit focus for a lot of pharmacies, prior authorization. And if your pharmacy is involved in any aspect of a prior authorization process, one, important to make sure that you are allowed to be involved. Two, if you are, to make sure you have a policy that identifies exactly what your involvement is and what the expectations of your pharmacy's involvement is. The other thing, FWA training, controlled substance management. The latter two, I'd say not so, it's still important for the pharmacy to have, not so much when it comes to like the audit process here. The other thing that I'll mention that's really important with policies and procedures is, and I can't stress this enough, is to make sure that they are specific to your pharmacy. There's a lot of great resources out there that will give you a starting point or like a template policy. Those are, again, great starting points, but that should not be an endpoint. It's really important to make sure those policies are specific to your pharmacy, that they are catered to how your pharmacy operates, and that you're revising them. You shouldn't just be taking a template, policy and just putting your name into it. You should be making sure you're going through it and making sure that it's specific to your pharmacy and the way it operates. Because the other thing that you're doing by just throwing your name onto a policy is suggesting that you are actually adhering to them. So you are essentially saying that you have those policies in place. And if you don't, then that becomes another point of concern a lot of times in audits as well, especially when you're being expected to provide copies of policies. The other thing is when it comes to audit results, a lot of the times when you see the word final audit result, a lot of the times pharmacies just say, okay, it's final, I can't do anything else. No, there is certain ability for you to be able to challenge final audit results to be able to prevent further action. When I say further action, like I said, it could escalate to regulatory action, to a state or federal agency, such as a board of pharmacy, or to the government. Or it could also result in network termination. And network termination can be a period of a year, which is starting to become less common, and more common a period of 2 years, and even more common, sometimes 5 years. In the instance of some PBMs, it could just be indefinite. And so when you receive these types of audit results and investigations, it's really important to try to reduce those discrepancies as much as possible and to make sure you kind of get some closure. And so when you see the words final, I would never want a pharmacy to really consider them to be final without understanding fully what its ability to further challenge them are. Like I said, some PBMs will allow you to further appeal certain appeal certain audits depending on the discrepancies. In the absence of that, a lot of pharmacies have the ability to further dispute results through counsel, or I believe independently, but usually through counsel, further audit results through the dispute resolution provision in your provider manual. That's a great tool to be able to further engage in a substantive discussion with the PBM over your audit results. And so it's really important that you don't get deterred by the word final on anything. And it's really important to understand if there's still an avenue for you to be able to challenge audit results, network terminations, even something as like a credentialing denial. Do you have the ability to further challenge those types of definitive responses from PBMs? The other things that are really helpful, especially when we're talking about audits, like I said, are fair audit laws. This is still applicable in the instances of where you're hit with a regular standard audit to make sure that in your state, you are aware of what protections you have under your state's fair audit laws and whether they would otherwise apply to your instant audit. Again, most states have an exception for potential FWA or the allegation of FWA or investigations. Nevertheless, there's still a lot of protections there. And does it mean that just because a PBM is saying, it's an investigation, I would never cite to a fair audit law? No, you can bet that I still will, because those investigations are basically audits. And just because PBMs are trying to find a loophole doesn't mean that we let them. So certainly understand what your state's fair audit laws are. Similarly, if you're worried about network access, things to keep in mind are unfair trade practice laws, but of course, any willing provider laws as well. But like I said, you guys are doing more than enough, not more than enough, more than a lot of pharmacies already are doing by just joining this type of a webinar and making sure you're looking internally as to what PBMs are otherwise doing externally to pharmacies. Really important to make sure you're doing regular audits, keeping up to date as to what pressure points are for pharmacies. And then, of course, like I said, be proactive rather than reactive. Like I said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us today.